Hello and welcome, chess fans. This is International Master Keaton Kira back with you again. Now, having just done a video series on the Roy Lopez with d4 on the fifth move, a very dangerous line, now I want to shift my attention to a little bit more tame and positional line, but still a very good line that can be a tremendous weapon, as it certainly was for me in my childhood. I'm talking about the exchange Roy Lopez. So let's go ahead and get started. So here we see the opening moves of the Roy Lopez with bishop b5 being the signature move. And after black plays a6, this time, rather than play bishop a4, which we saw in the last video series, we're going to discuss the idea of immediately taking on c6, which constitutes the exchange Roy Lopez. Maybe not the most creative name in the world. Okay, I'm not the best judge of that. So bishop takes c6, d takes c6. So what's it possible to say about this position? Why has white traded the bishop for the knight? Well, a few reasons. One is it controls the tempo of the game very well by forcing an exchange and keeping the game moving along without giving black much time to play his own plans. Also, a very significant reason is the damage that it does to black's pawn structure, which sometimes can come to really haunt black, as we'll see in the next video. Doubled pawns are not always the worst thing in the world, but in this particular structure, they can be a real problem for black. Now, the downside of the exchange Roy Lopez, and probably the reason that it's not quite as popular as playing bishop a4, is that it does hand black the bishop pair, which is something that we have to be a little bit careful about now for white, to not let the position get too open where black can realize the spoils of his bishop pair. So at first, it looks like white can simply grab a free pawn with knight takes e5, but there are a couple of concrete reasons why knight takes e5 is not the best move here for white. So if you like, you can go ahead and pause your video and try to think of why. If you need more time, you can keep your video paused. The reason that strong players don't play knight takes e5 here is that black has a couple of powerful forks that win back the pawn with interest. The first is queen to d4, attacking the knight and this pawn. So now if knight f3, the queen takes the pawn with check, and black stands a little bit better after winning this pawn, since white will soon lose his castling privileges. The other move that black can play here is queen g5, attacking the knight and attacking the pawn on g2, which also doesn't necessarily strip white of his castling privileges, but it's certainly going to make him think twice about castling kingside in this position. So that's why the main move for white in this position is to go ahead and castle. And now that white's done that, white is now threatening to capture the pawn on e5, since here black's tricks don't work. Now, if we could pretend that it was white's move again, and white were able to take the pawn on e5, you might ask, well, why can't black still play queen to d4? But the thing is, now white can just return the knight back to f3, and then if the queen takes the pawn on e4, he's met with a very unpleasant move, rook e1, pinning the black queen to the king. So this position, after white castles, revolves around black needing to defend this pawn on e5 and the many options that black has to do so. So pretty much any move that defends the pawn is a legitimate move, and then some. And the reason I say and then some is there are even some moves that are quite indirect that actually work here too. So black can play bishop d6. Black can play queen d6. Black can play f6. Now, you might say that moving this pawn, opening the roadway to the king, usually a bad idea. But in this particular position, black can get away with f6. So it's actually one of black's best moves here. Now, a couple of indirect ways of defending the pawn. Black can play bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen. Black can also play knight e7, which is a very strange looking move. But the idea is that if white plays knight takes e5, since there's no direct line to the black king, our fun and games with queen to d4 is back on, where black can go ahead and take this pawn on e4. So let's do a quick overview of all of the moves that black can play and how white should play against them. So bishop d6 is one very common move, after which white should play d4, immediately opening the position. Now here, black often takes on d4 with the pawn, and white actually is best off taking with the queen, immediately putting pressure on g7. Here, black has to play very precise. He would not want to play knight f6 and allow a central fork, but pawn to f6 is a good move here, where black can play the setup with knight e7, bishop e6, castles, and so forth, and chances are about level here. Also, it's worth mentioning that after white plays d4, it is also possible for black to play bishop g4 here, pinning the knight. Black's played that move before here too. So bishop d6 is a very playable move. Queen to d6 is also an interesting move. It looks a little bit more strange because it blocks the bishop, but black's plan here is to castle queenside, so to develop this bishop somewhere, castle long. And here we're usually in for an exciting game where both white and black are pawn storming their opponent's kings, and whoever gets there first is often in good position to win the game. A very popular option for black here is bishop g4, making use of the pin, and these lines often get very exciting. White plays pawn to h3, attacking the bishop. If the bishop makes the concession of taking the knight, white can claim to be slightly better here due to good development in pawn structure. And if bishop h5, which actually black sometimes plays, white can go pawn to g4, forcing the bishop back, and then take this pawn and claim to be better because of the extra pawn. Here, as we often see in these lines, black cannot take on e4 because the pin on the e file is just too cataclysmic. If the bishop were to move, the black queen would be lost. So after h3, it looks like the game is going in white's favor, but here black has a highly creative way of keeping the tension. Black can play pawn to h5 using a motif often called a fishing pole. The idea is to use this bishop as bait. If white takes the bishop, he'll usually meet a swift demise after h takes g4, opening this file to the king, where here, if white's knight were to move, black can simply play queen h4, threatening mate, and then if white moves the f pawn, trying to vacate the f2 square for the king, black can close the door by playing pawn to g3, with mate quickly to follow. So in these situations, white certainly cannot take the bishop, but rather would want to play d3, and now play often continues queen f6 with the idea of trading on f3 and compromising white's pawn structure. White could play something like knight d2, knight now maneuvers usually the g6, and after rook e1, the position gets very exciting. Black plays knight to g6, but white is getting closer to actually being able to take the bishop on g4. White can usually play something like d4, trying to blunt the possibility of a black bishop on this diagonal attacking the king, where if black takes, white can actually now take this bishop, and although it's scary, white's defenses normally hold here, as he's able to play something like knight f1. And even though black has some pressure, white is indeed up a piece. I hope you've enjoyed this video with the introduction to the exchange Roy Lopez and the many different lines that are common in this opening. In the next video, we're going to discuss this line with f6, which is a really critical line, and particularly the significant pawn structure that emerges from this line. Hey there, everyone. It's International Master Keaton Kira, back with you again, continuing this series on the Roy Lopez exchange variation. So again, going through the opening moves, where after a6, this time white plays, bishop takes knight on c6, black recaptures with the d-pawn, and after white castles, putting the pressure on this pawn on e5. In our last video, we saw the many ways that black has to try to defend this pawn. Now, in this video, we're going to focus on one of black's most popular ways of doing that, and even more significantly, the intriguing pawn structure that it creates. So what black often plays here is pawn to f6. This is an old school move. Has been around for years, supporting this pawn and now preparing to develop the position and play with the two bishops. White normally plays pawn to c5, where black goes ahead and takes, and then forces an endgame by playing c5, driving the knight away, and trading off the queens. Now, what I want to draw your attention to here is probably the most significant reason that white likes to play this opening, and that is to reach exactly this pawn structure. White's goal in this pawn structure is to trade as many pieces as possible and try to force a winning pawn endgame. So here I've removed all the pieces from the board to illustrate the power of white's pawn structure in this endgame. Now, a little aside here, as an experienced coach for well over 10 years, I've had my share of students complain to me about pawn structure. And my main point about pawn structure, which they always seem to be surprised by, is that it's just not that important. And it's really over-glorified in a lot of chess content, in a lot of videos, a lot of books. Is pawn structure important? Yes. So are a million other things.
Take me in the smoke, breathe me in and let me go. Sink to your heart to find you. Open up your eyes till you're blinded by the lies, so you can see what you do. Restless every time we start looking as a lost control. Oh, it's paradise with honesty, but I'm in the dead of the night. Teardrops on the floor. The pain is over. Feel the darkness take control.
I'm alone, I'm a broken home. I gave you all the bricks that I own and know. I'm letting go, I'm breaking these walls down, breaking these walls down. If you want adventure, then fly to home. But if you wanna travel, then go alone. Yeah, what's the point in us if I never know? Yeah, if you're gonna leave, I'ma let you go. I'm tired of the pain. Go away. I'm done with yesterday. Father. I fell where my demons dwell. My own little nightmare, I call it hell. Oh well, it's time to get back up. Climbing and climbing, I'm done with this ride, is what I tell myself, so I could feel something else. Yeah, I guess I had my bad days, but it doesn't mean I lost my style. Darling, where were you when my heart was on the ground? I thought time would prove that you would stick around. I guess time stands still, a king without his crown. Now I'm breaking and you're faking, girl. You never made a sound. I'm tired of the pain. Go away. I'm done with you.
Things though. And pawn structure in my book just isn't very high on the list. Chess really is all about pieces, and I'm really a big believer that piece play is the most important thing in chess. So that's just a little aside. But about that, I want to illustrate an important point, and that is that we are about to see the situation where doubled pawns are at their worst. It's normal for chess players to be much more phobic of doubled pawns than they need to be. Doubled pawns just aren't always that bad. and sometimes they can actually be quite good. But when doubled pawns are at their worst is when they cripple a majority. So this is the enormous problem that black has in this position. He has a 4-on-3 majority on the queen side, but black's majority is useless because the doubled pawns cripple the majority, making it incapable of producing a passed pawn. Meanwhile, white has a healthy majority on the king side and in the center, and that is enough with proper technique to give white the win. So let's just go through here and take a look at what proper technique means in this position. So white very possibly would want to start by playing f4. I think any normal move still gives white a winning position, but why not play f4, mobilize that central majority, and prepare to bring the king into the center? So, okay, let's say that black goes ahead and brings his king into the center, as does white. So now both sides have improved their kings. Time for black to try to do something with its pawns. So let's say that maybe black plays b5. But the problem that black's going to get here is his majority just cannot create a passed pawn. And there's even different setups that white can use here. One is that white could play b3. And if black ever pushes c4, white could take it. And if black doesn't push c4, if he just waits or something with his king, white can push c4. And this structure on the queen side that white has established is completely unbreakable. There's absolutely no way that black can break through and make a pass pawn, because his main problem is that one c pawn for white stops two c pawns for black. That's the problem with the doubled pawn majority. So what white wants to do is try to break through on the king side and create a healthy majority. So what we're going to see here is that really all black can do is wait. Black has no active plan, and for black to push his 3 pawns over here on the king side would only be a service to white. So the best thing that black can do is play king to e6, but here white can patiently push the majority. So white can play something like pawn to g4, and then as black waits, white can continue to push up the pawns, and then really it's just only a matter of time until white can break through, maybe take some space over here, and then bring his king. And then let's see, how's white actually going to get through here? Maybe black's actually made a little tricky by creating some sort of barrier, but I don't think it should be too bad still. White can play king f3, and then even some position with where f5 has been played, white can still like wait for the black king to have to move away. For example, if the pawns move, white can just kind of bide his time. And then when the black king moves, white can play king to f4 and eventually force this pawn through to e5. And here, this passed f pawn is going to carry the day for white. White can push up, and here the stuck black pawns on the queen side are just offering no resistance, and white has many paths to victory. White can play f7 and force a zugzwang, or white can use what the great author, international master Jeremy Silman, calls the fox and the chicken coop method, where you actually surrender this pawn and instead you come over here and win these pawns and then promote a passed pawn on the queen side. So many paths to victory for white in this famous king and pawn endgame. Hello, everyone. This is International Master Keaton Kira back with you again for our third and final installment of this series on the exchange Roy Lopez. So, in the first video, we did an overview of the opening. In the second video, we learned a very significant pawn structure of the opening. Here in the third video, I am going to show you a little bit different way that white can play the opening, which was a childhood favorite of mine. And I call it the delayed exchange Roy Lopez. So, what white can actually do here, which looks a little bit funky, is rather than taking on c6 here, white can play bishop a4. And here, after black makes his main move, knight f6, now white can take on c6, hence the delayed exchange. Now, you might say, wait a minute here, Keaton. Why would white ever want to waste time and then basically just play an exchange Roy Lopez a tempo down? But this is indeed a very good riddle for those of you guys who have watched the series, especially going back to that first video where I did an overview of all the lines. Can you think of why it might have been useful for white to waste a tempo here? If you like, you can pause your video and try to figure it out. So if you remember in the normal exchange, Roy Lopez, where white takes on c6, black takes, and white castles, think back to all the methods that black has of defending the pawn, and you'll see that really none of them are compatible with knight to f6. Isn't that interesting? The most logical square for the knight. So if you remember the one where black played bishop d6, the pawn actually went to f6 and the knight went to e7. Then the one that we saw in the most recent video, black played pawn to f6 here, obviously not compatible with knight f6. The line where black played bishop g4, the knight took the path of e7 and g6. So the thing is, in all these Roy Lopez exchange lines, the knight almost never belongs on f6. Knight f6 is a move that's really meant for a more standard kind of Roy Lopez position. So white is able to sometimes take advantage of that and coerce black playing into knight f6, only then to surprise him by going to an exchange variation. So here, after black takes with the d pawn, here the main move for white is d3. So notice that white has traded off his light square bishop, but white establishes the central pawns on the light color, the opposite color of the dark square bishop, which makes for a very strong dark square bishop. And after d3, supporting the central pawn, white is now threatening to capture black's pawn on e5, making it so that black needs to defend that pawn. So most of the time, black plays the bishop d6 idea here. Bishop g4 is not really all that effective, since h3 forces the bishop to trade on f3, since now obviously there's no h5 trick because white's uncastled and would cheerfully take that bishop on g4. And also bishop h5 doesn't work so well because g4 and then taking this pawn is basically an extra pawn for white, especially considering that, again, because white hasn't castled, his king doesn't have to be in all that open space on the king side, but rather white can play to castle queen side here, where the king would be much more safe. So in this position, black really would have to take on f3, leaving the position very comfortable for white. So the two main moves here really are bishop d6 and knight d7, but of course knight d7 is much more committal and really just rare. So bishop d6 is the move that we'll focus on. But here the main plan for white is to play knight d2 and bring the knight into c4, where it can have pressure on this bishop as well as the pawn on e5. So for example, if black castles, white can play knight c4, double attacking the pawn and also keeping a watchful eye on the bishop. And here black needs to add a defender. So black has some choices. It's possible to play knight back to d7 to add another defender. It's possible to play something like queen e7, and it's possible to play rook e8. But after black's play, white has a choice of a lot of different plans in these positions. If you want to create opposite color bishops, it's possible to trade the knight on c4 for the bishop on d6, and it's a fine opposite color bishops position for white. White certainly can castle, is very often a good idea. Let's say, for example, black plays knight d7, white can go ahead and castle. And here we see a number of thematic ideas. Sometimes white can play b3 and bishop b2 to add another attacker on the pawn on e5. Also, a very common plan is to move the knight from f3 either to h4. Okay, not right now. We won't allow the queen to take the knight, but at some point to try to bring the knight to h4 and to f5 to take advantage of that nice square, or a little more pedestrian to play h3. Say, for example, black plays something like rook e8, white could play h3. And here the plan is to bring this knight to h2, but don't be fooled. It's not just a retreating move. You have to see my old video, Retreating to Win, here on chess.com. Knight h2, the idea really is to bring the knight to g4, which can be a very good attacking square for the knight, but also the plan of knight h2 is to push the pawn to f4, breaking the position open and bringing the white rook on f1 into the game, where it can have many targets here on the f file. And as soon as the white queen and bishop come into the attack, white can organize pressure on black's king. So this delayed exchange Roy-Lopez, in conclusion, can be a very surprising and interesting weapon for you to use, especially if you're pretty well familiar with the main ideas of the exchange Roy-Lopez. I hope you've enjoyed this series thoroughly and have learned a lot about the plans and the pawn structure of the exchange Roy-Lopez. And I hope you'll give this opening a try, and I hope your results with it will be fantastic.
it all